Hi, class, Dr. Lindner. So we're still on organic compounds, and what we're going to finish up with is high energy compound. When we think of high energy compound, really what I want you to think about is ATP. That's what we're going to be focusing on. So to perform the vital functions, the cells must use energy. And where are they going to get the energy? From breaking down organic substrates by catabolism. It's going to break down proteins and break down carbohydrates and break down fats. The body always wants to use carbohydrates first for fuel. Then it's going to break down fats and lipids. And lastly, it doesn't want to use proteins because our muscles are made of protein, our organs are made of protein. And this is what we see when people are chronically ill. When they are in a hospital setting or in hospice, they can pretty much calculate and figure out how long the person has yet to live, because if they're not getting their energy from food, from the input of foods, then it means they're using their own body proteins to generate ATP. When you break down the heart and you break down the liver, there's not much time left, right? So the high energy bond is a covalent bond whose breakdown releases the energy. And that energy that's released is the energy that the cells and all the organelles are going to be using. In our cells, the high energy compound connects a phosphate group, which we know is PO4, to an organic molecule. And when the body does that, we call that phosphorylation. So if we have, just for simplicity, if we have adenosine and it's phosphorylated once, then we call it adenosine monophosphate, mono meaning one phosphate. If we create another bond and we add another phosphate group, now there's two phosphates, it's adenosine diphosphate. And if we phosphorylate it a third time, now we have three phosphates, it's adenosine triphosphate. Okay. Um, so making bonds and breaking bonds. The body doesn't like to keep adenosine triphosphate hanging around too long. So the body can kind of break this bond and connect this phosphate group to an amino acid called creatine. So we'll have something called creatine phosphate hanging around here. When the body needs energy, the body will use an enzyme to break this away and put that phosphate right back. And the body can go through this cycle of making the bond and creating the bond, so the body will have ADP, and then CP is adjacent. It's kind of hanging nearby, and it can always add or subtract that phosphate group. It's just phosphates don't hang out by themselves. They always hang out attached to creatine. So it's creatine phosphate. Okay. So the body can break down and remove a terminal phosphate group, or it can add one. So hydrolysis of ATP, which is the removal of a terminal phosphate group, uses an enzyme called adenosine triphosphatase. Adenosine triphosphatase. And that is going to release energy. Okay, but that leaves us with ADP, adenosine diphosphate. So we went from here. Now we have adenosine diphosphate. It removed that, and it's going to attach it to creatine phosphate. So adenosine triphosphatase can do that. Now, the synthesis of ATP, there's another enzyme called adenosine ATP synthase. Synthase sounds like to synthesize, and that's going to catalyze the addition of a terminal phosphate group to ADP. So if you have adenosine mono, now you have adenosine diphosphate, ATP synthase, adds on that third phosphate again, okay? So ATP is needed for muscle contraction. It's needed for the transport of substances across cell membranes, especially when things are going against the concentration gradient, right? So if we have a cell and there is a nucleus, and there's always lots of sodium on the outside, and there's always lots of oxygen on the outside, and there's always lots of potassium on the inside. So, due to this law, concentration gradient, things always go from where there's a higher concentration to where there's a lesser. So, there may be some sodium in here, but definitely more on the outside than the inside. So, sodium wants to go in, higher concentration to less, and potassium is moving out. But now, to maintain the membrane potential, we want to bring things back to their original state. So now we want to try and bring the sodium that rushed in out. But now we're pushing it against the concentration gradient. There's still a whole lot more of sodium out here. So to get the sodium back out and the potassium back in, it requires energy to do that. And it uses ATP in order to do that, because now we need energy to push things against their concentration gradient, because we're going from a lesser concentration to a higher. Just think about like swimming with the tide. Doesn't take lots of energy, but if you're swimming against the tide, it takes a whole lot more energy. Okay. And so you'll see that when we talk about the sodium potassium pump when we get into the cell. So ATP is needed for a whole lot. And that's what we're seeing down here on the bottom. Let me just clear my. So here we can see here's adenine plus its sugar. This is ribose. So together it's adenosine. And then you have monophosphate, diphosphate, triphosphate. You got 3 phosphate groups. Now, let's look at the big picture. How do we generate this ATP? Well, that's why we breathe. We breathe in oxygen, and what are we pushing out? Carbon dioxide. Where is this carbon dioxide coming from? Well, we'll see in a second. But we need oxygen. The oxygen comes in. It's going to transport those gases through the circulatory system, and it's going to try and bring in that oxygen into the cell, specifically the mitochondria, because we know the mitochondria is called the powerhouse of the cell because it's producing energy in the form of ATP. Well, how is it producing energy? Well, the mitochondria is responsible for producing ATP, but in order to do that, it's taking glucose, right? That 6-carbon sugar, and it's going to interact with oxygen. And by doing that within the cell, especially in the mitochondria, through cellular respiration, which is the Krebs cycle, which is the citric acid cycle, through that in the mitochondria, through the Krebs cycle, well, first we should say glycolysis, then the Krebs cycle, then the electron transport chain. These 3 steps in this order, eventually, after the electron transport chain, we're going to get lots of ATP, water, and carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is what we expire. We inspire, breathe in oxygen. So the CO2 that we give off is actually a byproduct from the mitochondria. So here we have glucose. This is the cell membrane right here. Here's glucose. We know it's a 6-carbon sugar. It enters the cell. It enters the cell through what we call a GLUT4 transporter, GLUT4 transporter, and it's like a doorway, right? It's like a doorway. They're actually in the cytoplasm, but when insulin is stimulated, it's going to move these glucose carrier molecules from the cytoplasm to the cell membrane, and it's going to allow glucose to be carried in. Okay, glucose is too big to be carried in by itself. So it needs a transporter, a transport protein, or a carrier molecule. So these GLUT4 transporters is like a doorway that allows glucose to enter in. Now, once glucose enters in, glycolysis is when it takes this and splits it. So now we don't have a 6-carbon sugar. Now we have 2 3-carbon sugars. And those 2 3-carbon sugars is what we call pyruvate or pyruvic acid. And as long as oxygen is present, the pyruvate can enter into the mitochondria for the citric acid cycle. The citric acid cycle, or sometimes they call it the tricyclic acid cycle. Okay, so we will refer to this as either the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle. And the purpose of the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle is that it makes coenzymes. The coenzymes are NAD and FAD. And the coenzymes that are produced are used by the electron transport chain, the ETC, the electron transport chain. And you'll see that that is what is actually responsible for making the majority of the ATP, water, and CO2, which we breathe out. If oxygen is not present, then pyruvate, in the absence of oxygen, becomes lactic acid, which is another type of sugar. And lactic acid can convert itself back into glucose. And then glucose can go through this cycle again. It can be broken down. We call it glycolysis. Glycolysis takes place in the cytosol when we break down the glucose into pyruvic acid or pyruvate. When oxygen is present, pyruvic acid can enter the mitochondria. It makes some other conversions. We see acetyl-CoA is the next thing that it converts itself into, and that can enter into the Krebs cycle. And that's responsible for making some ATP, not a lot, but it makes some ATP. It gives off also carbon dioxide, but it primarily makes the coenzymes NAD and FAD. And these coenzymes are responsible for carrying electrons over into the electron transport chain. Your Krebs cycle, the Krebs cycle needs your B vitamins to function, especially B1, B2, and B3. B1, B2, B3, energy. B1, B2, B3, energy. It really needs that quite a bit. And the electron transport chain, the ETC, is really dependent on iron, CoQ10, coenzyme Q10. It needs magnesium, and it needs zinc. And that's why, remember, CoQ10 came up quite a bit when people use statin drugs. The statins not only decrease cholesterol, but in that same pathway to make cholesterol, the body makes CoQ10. So if you're blocking the enzyme that's needed to make cholesterol, if you're blocking the enzyme that's needed to make cholesterol, you're also blocking CoQ10 production, which will impact the mitochondria's ability to produce ATP. And if the mitochondria is dysfunctioning, mitochondrial dysfunction, you ask yourself, where do we have the most mitochondria in the body? Liver has plenty, the neural system, the brain has plenty, the heart has plenty, muscles, skeletal muscles have plenty. So those things malfunction. When muscles malfunction and they cry in pain, it goes through myalgia. Anything with the word algia means pain. And then nerves experience dysfunction. We call it neuralgia. And then joints experience pain. It's called arthralgia. And the brain experiences dysfunction. We call it cognitive impairment. So you have to be kind of careful with that. You have to be pretty careful with that stuff. And think of what happens if someone's iron deficient. If you don't have iron, you're fatigued, right? Iron deficiency anemia, there's fatigue. Can't produce ATP without it. Magnesium is needed, and so is zinc. So a lot of essential nutrients are very important for ATP production. So here's our overview. This pretty much covers the two major classifications, which are inorganic compounds and organic compounds. Now, under inorganic, we spoke mostly of water, right? We talked about the building blocks of water being hydrogen and oxygen. It's absorbed from the diet, or it's generated by metabolism, just like we showed you here. Metabolism through energy production, the body, one of its end products is water and CO2. If we also talked about acids and bases and salts. So acids, bases, and salts. When we spoke about organic compounds, we spoke about carbs, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids, and high energy compounds. So you can review this page, review their sources, and then you can review their primary functions. And if you need to use the videos as resources again to go over some of these main categories, you certainly can. The inorganic, there were some dissolved gases, and we spoke about these where we have oxygen, we have carbon, we have nitrogen, and these are all found throughout the atmosphere, also byproducts of metabolism, right? So if we think of the O for oxygen, it's required for cellular metabolism. If we think of the C, the carbon and oxygen, carbon dioxide, it's generated by the cells as a waste product. And then when we combine nitrogen and oxygen, we get nitric oxide. And that's one of the chemical messengers in the cardiovascular system, the neural system, and lymphatic system. We think of NO, or nitric oxide, in the cardiovascular system as a vasodilator, right? It opens up blood vessels. When people have angina pectoris or chest pain, they could put nitroglycerin, which is a form of nitric oxide, under the tongue, and you get this quick, rapid vasodilation, and it gets rid of the angina or the chest pain. But it's also utilized in the neural system and the lymphatics as well.